I think you know you're working with teachers and former teachers when someone slides you a piece of candy right before you start to talk and winks at you. Thank you. So thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here today. And I'm actually here with my kids, so you'll have a chance to see them at some point and judge my parenting, which is always nice for everybody. But it's really great to be here. I was with you this morning, and I was really struck when we were listening to Eli by this group and your incredible capacity to lean into discomfort, ask hard questions, make yourself vulnerable. I love the person who asked a question and then said, "Oh, I guess I messed that up." And it was like, so much humility in that learning, and I think that's such an important aspect of learning to talk about identity issues. And I appreciate that you bring that into this room. And I also just appreciated how we heard voices of students who could talk about things that we as adults can't even talk about, that they have great language for it, that they often know their experiences so much better than we do, and they know the words for it. And so, I'm just holding on to that as we talk about, well, what do white children need to know about race? Because we know that children often can talk about topics that we can't talk about, and race is one of those things. I want to start by telling you a story, partly because storytelling is part of building relationships around difference and sharing our experiences. So I want to share a little bit of my experiences growing up. I'm also going to be talking today about what white children need to know about race and how families socialize their children around race. And so I want to start by giving you one story of racial socialization, which comes from my family. So I grew up in a predominantly white family in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And these are my siblings. I'm the one with the blue sweater. And in my household, we never talked about race. And I didn't know that, of course, when I was growing up. I didn't realize that that's part of what was happening. I just, my family, I considered them good people. We went to church on Sundays, and we did a lot of volunteer work, and we did study abroad. We often had students come study abroad and live in our houses. It wasn't that I was oblivious to like multiculturalism or something. But we didn't talk about race, and we had, we didn't have many people of color in our community, and I didn't have any black teachers until I went to college. I didn't have any black classmates until I went to college. And so I basically spent the first 18 years of my life thinking I'm supposed to be colorblind. That's how you be good as a white person. And I believe that's what my parents would have told you also. If you had said to them, well, what do you teach your kids about race? They would have said, well, what is there to teach them? We say, treat everybody fairly and be colorblind. That's what a white child should know about race. But otherwise, we don't talk about it. And it wasn't like there was a big sign that said, you cannot talk about race. It wasn't that explicit. But if you think about it, in every family, there's a short list of rules that tells you what you're allowed to talk about and you're not allowed to talk about it. And if you talk about it, it's embarrassing, right? It's like there's certain things I can't talk about in front of my parents. Certain movies I might watch on my own, but I can't watch them with my parents. Race was like that kind of conversation that I felt like I wasn't allowed to have. So then I get to college. And in college, I went to a liberal arts college with some it was like very laissez-faire. There were very few requirements. The two main requirements for graduation were that you be able to swim. That was one. You pass a swim test, and the other was that you take a class on diversity. It has to have a little star, meaning it's a diversity course. So I signed up for a class on African American literature, which honestly I would not have taken if it was not required. And not because I didn't want to take it or because I wasn't interested in taking it, but because I felt like that's a place I didn't belong. I felt like, well, I don't know if I'll be welcome there. I don't know if the other students will want me around. I don't know anything about this topic. But I was interested in it. But even when I went into class the first day, I felt like this isn't a place for me. Like, the professor's black, half the students are black. So is this really where I'm supposed to be? And it was required, so I stayed. And I found myself early on tripping over words and stumbling and stuttering and just kind of looking around and thinking, are they talking about me? You know, like somebody would say something about the great white savior complex, and I'd be like, I don't know what that is, but somehow I thought it applied to me, but I wasn't sure. And I constantly felt like I had a spotlight on me, and like I couldn't really see everybody else. I could just see what was going on for me, and I'd get stressed, and I'd feel like if I turned my head this way, then I would possibly reveal that I was racist, and if I turned it that way to look at a student who was talking, then I'd reveal that I was ignorant. It was like, I felt trapped, you know, like, how do I show that I'm not racist? And the truth is, maybe I am. So it was like all this stuff going on for me, which made it very distracting to be engaged with the material. And in the class, we read a novel a week by an African-American author. And they weren't all about racism, but most of them touched on racism at some point. And somebody said to me, look, you know how to discuss books, right? So go into your class and say one thing. Every time you have class, say one thing. So what I found was I would go into class and I had this little comfort zone where I was okay talking about race, and I would say one thing, I'd like struggle to get it out, and I'd step outside my comfort zone in doing that, and it would get bigger. My comfort zone got bigger when I stepped outside of it. And then I'd do it again the next class, and it got bigger again. And I just kept stepping. It was like, just step over that line, and my comfort zone kept expanding until the end of the semester, when I had this much expanded capacity for talking about race, for listening, for thinking about it, and I didn't feel quite so pressured by that spotlight, that stereotype threat of, am I going to prove that I'm racist in this conversation? And by the end of the semester, I realized two things. One was racism has a huge impact on the history of our country. And so we have to talk about it. We haven't undone what we started, and that really was cemented for me in living in South Africa, hearing so many South Africans in 1998 say, this happened, and this apartheid was in the past. Can't we just get over it? And I'm like, it just ended 4 years ago. You know, like, it's not in the past, but then I thought, well, in the US, we say the same thing. We constantly say, it's in the past, can't we just get over it? But we haven't fixed it yet, so we have to be able to talk about it. But the other thing I learned in that class was that I'm not very good at talking about this, but apparently you can get better. And I hadn't realized that. In fact, early on in the class, I would sit there, you know, watching everybody talk, and there was this one woman in the back row, Hillary Lay, and I'd watch her. And she knew the answers to everything. She was so smart, and she knew all the history of every event that we discussed. She knew about it already, and she knew the leaders and the key actors, and I would just watch her, and I figured she must be biracial or multiracial, because she had this ability to talk about race that I thought only people of color had. So in addition to being pretty naive and basically being colorblind and not being able to talk about race, I thought that people of color were basically biologically predetermined to be able to talk about race, and white people were biologically predetermined to mess it all up. And so clearly Hillary must be a person of color, because I've never seen a white person talk about race like that. So I'm watching her throughout the semester, and then one day in class she says something about, you know, as a white woman, as a white person. And I'm thinking, how is that possible? How is Hillary Lay a white person? I thought white people were not biologically able to have this conversation. And then, so I watched her a little bit more, trying to figure out the key, like, where does she come from? Who is Hillary Lay? How did she learn this? And then one day it was revealed, Hillary Lay was from San Francisco. And for me, it was like, oh, great. Okay, so people of color and white people from San Francisco, of course, they can talk about race, but white people from the suburbs of Pittsburgh are never going to be able to. And honestly, I don't know how long I held on to that, because at the end of that, I started realizing I can do this. I can get better at it. And by the end of that semester, I was still not very good at it, but I knew I could improve. But it wasn't until I don't know, 10 years ago when I was working with Howard Stevenson at Penn, and he said, no, it's like we just need to have a growth mindset. Everybody can build the skills to talk about race. People of color are good at it because they have to do it. You know, it's like Eli talking about transgender children. They can talk about it from a young age because they have to be able to make sense of and explain their experiences to people around them. If you have to do it, you build the skills to talk about it. But you weren't born being able to talk about it. You built the skills over a lifetime. White people can also build skills for talking about race, but we have to make it a priority, because for most white people, we don't wake up in the morning and have to deal with racism in a way that impacts our survival. And that's really the difference, and that's partly why I did not grow up really having the skills to do this. So we're going to talk about, so what do white children need to know about race? What is it that they need to learn? I'm going to give you some framing concepts for thinking about that. But first I want to just share my other motivation for doing this topic. These are my kids when they were younger. They're now 3 and 6. But part of how I started looking into what do we need to teach white children about race was realizing I'm going to have some white children. And I need to know what to tell them, what's age appropriate for a 2-year-old or even a 1-year-old. What should we be talking about as the years go on? And so they continue to be a major motivator for me, even though I know 15 years from now, 20 years from now, when they're grown and gone, they're going to just rip apart every book I ever wrote because it's going to be out of date and I'm going to be politically incorrect, and they're going to know so much more than I do. In the meantime, as children, what is it that I need to teach them to enable them to critique my work one day? So as Matthew mentioned, I study whiteness, and you know, at Columbia they told me you can't do that here because it was done in the 90s. We already know everything there is to know about whiteness. And I was like, if we knew everything there was to know about whiteness, wouldn't things look different in this world? Wouldn't we be somewhere else? And so I went to Penn, and they said, yes, we would love for you to study that. We'll support you even though we can't teach it to you. And my big concern with studying whiteness, well, first of all, I wanted to know more about myself, how I fit into the greater racial picture of the United States. I often would show up at workshops or conversations on race and feel like the best thing I could do was like nod empathetically when people of color shared their stories and feel really guilty and bad, and then maybe make other white people feel guilty and bad. Like that's what I could do. That's what I could do for racial justice. And that was my naive understanding of like how this works. Because I didn't know, where do white people fit in? We often don't talk about white people in the conversation except overtly racist white people. And that's not how I saw myself. So then where do I fit? So that was one reason. Another reason why I study whiteness is because white middle-class teachers comprise over 85% of the teaching population. So when we talk about race in education, we often scrutinize the outcomes of students of color, or we scrutinize communities of color, as if they exist in some kind of independent bubble from everything else, not looking at the predominantly white teaching force, the predominantly white administration, predominantly white policymakers, predominantly white textbook writers. Schools of education are full of white teacher educators who teach predominantly white teachers. So if we're not looking at education holistically at the whiteness of kind of all of the basically bodies of implementation of education, then we're not really talking about race in education. And I wanted to round out the conversation, both to see where do I fit, and also so that because I feel like we're not going to be able to solve a problem if we can't look at it in its entirety. Often whiteness is seen as invisible or normal, so it's not named. So some of you might be sitting there thinking like, this is kind of weird to talk about whiteness. I haven't done this before. That's because whiteness is often an unnamed norm. It's an assumed identity. So in novels or in newspaper articles, authors often don't name the race of the person that the article is about, unless they are a person of color. Or in novels, they'll give indications of kind of racial markers so that you can see that this is a person of color. But that's often just left out when the characters are white. And so it's like this unnamed thing. Unless it's named, then you're white. Color blindness, which I grew up in with color muteness, the idea that we should not talk about race, are huge aspects of whiteness that impact how this conversation doesn't happen in schools. And then I'm just gonna skip that one about prior research. Amanda Lewis is a sociologist who talks about race. She says she has this theory about why whiteness doesn't get talked about more in academic literature. And she says maybe it's because we tend to think about racial groups as connected to social problems. And like if you're a racial group that has like a connection or a link with social problems, then you get talked about as a racial group, and maybe white people don't get talked about as a group because they're not often linked to social problems. And she says, and I agree, that we need to start thinking about white people as being linked to social problems, that any racial issue we have in our society implicitly involves white people, whether white people are damaged or oppressed or hurt by it, or are being benefited by it. Either way, we're part of the racial problem. And so part of my reframe in thinking about that is that white people are part of the problem. We all necessarily are. Any racial problem in our society comprises all of us. And what that means then is that white people are also part of the solution. And this is one of the keys for me, is realizing I am part of the problem, and that means I can and should be part of the solution, which forever I thought wasn't true. I didn't know that I had a role in fixing problems with race and education. And when we do this reframe, I think it helps us see that white people can be part of the solution. So we're going to be talking about white racial socialization today, which is essentially how families socialize their children around race and racism and what it means to be white. How do families teach their children that? And to start, I want to just give you a chance to do a little bit of storytelling, to share whatever your racial background is, to share with one other person, how was race talked about in your house growing up? And what was the racial context where you grew up? You might have grown up in a place where you talked about race all the time. I imagine every person in this room has had a different experience. But what I'm going to give you 4 minutes, so 2 minutes each, to talk with one other person at your table about how race was talked about in your family of origin when you were growing up. So I'm going to keep sharing about racial socialization. And this is the definition that comes from Howard Stevenson, that it is the actions parents and others take to influence racial self-efficacy beliefs, or the beliefs that children hold about being able to resolve the racial stressors and conflicts in the world. And traditionally, in the racial socialization literature, there were 4 main findings about how parents talk to their kids about race. And one was around cultural socialization, what people in our group do, how you be if you're part of our group. Preparation for bias, so under no circumstances will you will you have an interaction with the police, or if somebody says this, here's how you might respond. Just being prepared to encounter a world that's not completely fair. A promotion of mistrust, which actually doesn't happen in a lot of families. It's less than 2% of families, but it's out there. And then egalitarianism, which is that everybody should be treated equally, which is a pretty common theme. But what happened in the literature, in the research, is that they would make these giant quantitative measures and give them to people of all different racial groups. And when the measures came back from white people, the only thing that they do is teach about egalitarianism. That, like the other, they didn't really show up on the other measures. And so for a long time, researchers said, it looks like white people don't really socialize their kids around race. And what we wanted to, as a research team, we said, that can't possibly be true. Or we have to have a different measure around it. Because like in my family, we wouldn't show up on these measures as really doing anything. But the fact that we didn't talk about race and that I was actively socialized to be colorblind is a form of racial socialization. And so that's what we intended to look at with this research. And so we interviewed families. We interviewed parents and teenagers in their homes, one after the other, and then we interviewed them together to see how they interacted around questions of race. And you know, it wasn't very easy to get participants because we had we're like, so can we come to your house for 3 hours on a Sunday afternoon with a video camera and videotape how you talk to your children about race, and surprisingly, we didn't have people knocking down our door to participate. So it's a pretty small sample size. We have 36 interviews, but we're using the qualitative information that we got from these interviews to design a national quantitative study that will go out to a much broader cross-section of white people, which actually will be really powerful, especially now, because I think the ways that people talk about race right now, with so much overt racism in the media, might be changing. We'll see. But one of the things we were looking to find out is what are white families teaching their children about race and racism. So let me just give you, so this is not all white families. These are well-educated families, middle-class families from outside of, they're basically from the suburbs of Philadelphia. Most of them sent their kids to independent schools. So just to have a sense, a lot of these families might be similar to families in your schools. What do you think families in your schools are teaching white children about race and racism? What are some of the messages they're giving? All right, so what you are observing in terms of what your students are learning is very consistent with the stuff that we were finding in our interviews with students. So we found that parents would say, being white is meaningless. And kids would say that too. It doesn't, that doesn't really describe me. I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I'm a, something, I don't know, teacher, but I'm not white. That word doesn't resonate with me. It's just, that's, Caucasian, it's a label, but it's not something that describes me. I identify more as being Irish than I do with being white. So, and being white, it doesn't have any meaning. And kids, there were a couple of kids who actually said, we said, well, so how do you identify in terms of race? And they would say, oh, I'm just normal. So not really, and I'm like, well, that's probably what I would have said if you asked me that question at 16, I had a similar background to a lot of these kids. Color blindness, so you should judge others by their actions, and just don't see their color, don't see their race, don't pay attention to that. Focus on values. So people spoke about a focus on values, and it constantly came out as if they felt like, well, it's not that our kids can't play with other kids of other races. It's just that we want our kids to be friends with and to date people who have the same values as we have. And then there was this implicit underlying assumption that people of color don't have the same values that we have. So, but it was the values piece that differentiated the friends' choices. Don't be racist. Racism is wrong. But with a framing of racism as if it's individual and overt. So police brutality is wrong. Slavery was wrong. And these kind of overt acts of racism are wrong, but not really seeing racism as something that could be systemic, or subtle, or like microaggressions. Just as long as you're not racist, you're aracial and you're all set. We had one interview where we were with a mom and a daughter, and in the middle of the interview, the mom just said, I just have to know, are you racist? And the daughter said, no, Mom, I'm not racist. And the mom was like, oh, thank God. And it was like it had been building up to this moment, and the fact that her daughter was not a card-carrying member of the KKK meant she had done her job as a parent. As long as the child does not self-identify as racist, we're cool. So, and that was a pretty common sentiment, like, we're not racist, so therefore, what else does a child need to know about race? Racism is in the past. We have a black president. Racism ended when Obama was elected. Before that, it ended when we had the civil rights movement. You know, it ended when we had slavery. It's like all these points where there was no more racism, but then obviously there still is racism, but kids really felt like, no, it's in the past. And then there was assimilation-based integration. If people act like us and talk like us and dress like us and walk like us, then we can be friends with them. But if they talk slightly differently or dress slightly differently, or we don't approve of what their parents do, or we think they have different values, then they can't be friends. So as long as they kind of do everything the way we do it, we're cool. A big theme we saw was that for young children, families were trying to be proactive in terms of reading multicultural literature, giving their kids images of people of color in books. And then for teenagers, they were just like, we wait until they ask questions, and then we answer their questions. And so we would ask, like, well, so when does race come up? And they're like, well, you know, when there's like a conflict at school, someone used the N-word, or like somebody got shot and we saw it on the news. So the only time kids were talking to their parents about race was when there was a conflict at school or in the news. There were no other conversations about race. And so this is significant because then you're doing two hard things. You're talking about race, which you have no practice doing, and you're talking about a conflict. And that was pretty consistent across families. And then this is, I think, really important for schools. And I don't know who made this PowerPoint, but there's an error in the bottom line. It wasn't me. Just kidding, it was me. So just do it and don't talk about it. This was very consistent. We send our kids to racially diverse schools because that's where they're going to make friends with people of color. They're going to learn how to talk with kids of color. They're going to learn all those 21st century skills of being, you know, racially literate by going to school with kids of color. And I think this is so important because you all run those schools where parents are like, well, if I just send them to school, they'll learn this stuff. And actually what we know is that if kids just show up at school together and sit next to each other, first of all, sometimes their stereotypes are heightened if they don't have a school where they're talking about stereotypes and they're talking about biases. We also know that in a lot of schools, kids in color and white kids are tracked away from one another in terms of higher level, lower level classes. And so sometimes there's still, even if they're going to a racially diverse school, there's still racial segregation. But the bottom line is that if they're not talking about it, integration is it doesn't necessarily happen naturally. So our major conclusion was that the parents actually wanted race not to matter. That's what they said to us in their interviews. We think race shouldn't matter. And the kids' understanding of that was, race doesn't matter. So do you see the difference there? The parents were acting and talking and socializing their kids around the idea that race shouldn't matter, and I agree, race shouldn't matter, but it does. And the parents knew that it did. The kids didn't know that it does. The kids were a little bit more oblivious, or they felt like race doesn't actually matter. And then one of the problems that happened in the course of this work is that we would say to kids, so why do you think that more kids are in the higher level AP, more white children are in your AP English class? Or that your AP English class, you said you go to a racially diverse school, but the AP English class is almost all white, and that you don't have peers of color in that class. Why do you think that is? And they would be like, maybe they don't care as much about English, or maybe they're more interested in sports, or you know, maybe their parents can't help them, you know, and they'd like try to come up with these explanations that ended up putting the explanation on the child themselves instead of seeing some systemic causes. And basically what we found is like kids believe that race doesn't matter, but then when you ask them to explain a racist phenomenon, they have all these kind of myths that they rely on to explain it. Why do you think black neighborhoods, why do you think that particular black neighborhood is poorer than your neighborhood, and why and you're not allowed to go there? Why do you think that happened? They can't explain it through segregation. They can't explain the laws about redlining that kept black people out of the suburbs. So they say things like, well, maybe they just don't work hard. So when asked to explain the kind of racial landscape of our reality, they end up relying on racist explanations because they don't have an anti-racist analysis in their head. So even though they think race doesn't matter, it's not like they're not still picking up all of these messages from our society that's they're readily available for them to use to explain things. So I want to ask you this. What is the impact on the school community of white people being socialized to be colorblind and unaware of race? If many of your students are white students are socialized to be colorblind, and let's say a good number of your teachers are socialized to be colorblind and unaware of race, what is the impact on the school community? Take just another 2 minutes to talk to the person that you spoke to before. Thank you. Well, let me share a couple of things. So part of the work that we did as a research team, we would leave these interviews and parents would be like, so did we get it right? Are we teaching the right thing? Like, so you mentioned that thing about what are we teaching them about being white? What are you supposed to teach them about being white? And we'd say, oh, don't worry, we're gonna write something and we're gonna tell you. Unfortunately, we didn't realize that, if you have a 14-year-old, a paper that comes out 3 years later is not that valuable to you, because they're 17. And I think that was actually a big regret of our research, is that we didn't tell them right away, because we also did follow-up phone calls with them, and we didn't want to bias it, but people want to know, what am I supposed to be teaching my kids about race? And one of the things that that is a framing idea for us in terms of what we think parents could be doing, schools could be doing, comes from Beverly Daniel Tatum, who's the former president of Spelman College. She's a psychologist who writes extensively about racial identity development. And she says that typically in public discourse about race, there's 3 ways that white people participate. One is as ignorant, one is as colorblind, and the other is as racist. So given that, who wants to be white? Who's signing up to say oh yeah, I self-identify as a white person? Because it seems like those are the 3 ways to be white. And she says there needs to be a 4th way. There needs to be the possibility for white people to move into an anti-racist identity, to see how race and racism impact their lives, and to say, but I'm working to be an anti-racist white person. I'm trying to be an anti-racist white person. And this book that we published that Matthew mentioned is 15 stories of 30 white people, 15 stories of white people who've spent more than 30 years working for racial justice, because there aren't a lot of role models of white people who worked against racism. Jim Lowen also has a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, and there's a whole chapter on the history of anti-racism that also has models. But there aren't a ton of models for white people to look at and say, well, what does that look like to be an anti-racist white person? And so then as a team, we asked, well, what could white racial socialization be? And the reason why we wanted it to not just be guiding principles, but also knowledge and skills, because anti-racism isn't just something that lives in your head, it's about taking action. And so what are possibilities for white racial socialization? One is to say, talking about race is not racist. Race has a huge impact on our lives, and not just in negative ways. There's ways that it informs our identities and our communities and our culture. And so race is it's not only bad. And we can talk about it. We can talk about it when there's not conflict. Sometimes, if you mention race, kids will say that's racist. Or, I've been in faculty meetings where somebody will say, we said we'd have a person of color for this search, and we actually only have 3 white candidates, so we need to look at that. And somebody will say, are you calling me racist? And it's no, I'm not calling you racist, and it's not racist to bring it up. Sometimes there's race talk that perpetuates racism, and there's race talk that mitigates racism, and we need to learn the difference. And then there's just race talk about how it impacts our lives, and it's not racist. Race should also not only come up at times of conflict. There could be lots of opportunities to talk about it, to teach kids about it, to talk about it with one another. And again, talking about it when there's not conflict means we're only doing one hard thing. And it also means we're building skills and practicing for when we're talking about race in times of conflict. Race and racial differences do matter. They're not all bad. Difference is good. And I think really emphasizing with children that difference is good, uniqueness is good, is an important thing, because they have such a drive to be the same, and yet they need to learn to value differences. Racism negatively impacts everyone. I think this sometimes gets lost. So people will say, well, who am I as a white person to counter a racist comment? You know, like, what am I gonna say? That you might offend this person over here? You know, like, don't tell that joke, you might offend her. And I think it's important to get to the point where you can say, actually, I'm offended by racism, because the assumption that I would think that was funny really undermines me. Or, you know, I think it undermines all of us. Those kinds of comments undermine all of us. And so anti-racist action is not something you do on the behalf of somebody. You do it because racism really makes all of us less whole. And then being white may not have meaning for you, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have meaning. So in your experience, you can't see the ways that it might have meaning, and yet it might have had a huge impact. It likely had a huge impact on your life. Some content knowledge includes an understanding of systemic racism and seeing how our communities and our schools even have been shaped by racist policies in the past. I grew up in an all-white community, not all white, it was 99.8% white, 10 miles away from a community that was basically 99% black, and we really didn't mix with each other. And for the longest time, I thought I lived in an integrated community, because we had 4 people of color in my community, and they went to school with us, and we weren't mean to them, you know, so we were integrated. And I didn't see that actually that was a story of segregation. And there were policies that made my school district all white. There were policies just a year before I was born. There was a Supreme Court case, Milliken versus Bradley, that said you don't have to share funding in metro areas between the cities and the suburbs. And that meant that the suburbs could continue to, you know, use all of their real estate taxes for maintaining suburban education and municipal systems. And so, and I didn't realize that like those kinds of policies, along with individual acts of violence, maintained a white community that was safe and pretty and had a blue ribbon school for me to grow up in. That's the kind of systemic racism that helps you understand your racial reality if you know the history. And if you don't know the racial history, you just think, well, I don't know, I think our community is all white and we have a really good school because we care about education. We're good people who care about education, and we believe in paying high taxes so that we can go to this expensive school. And that was the narrative in my community. And I didn't see the systemic racism that shaped our community. Narratives, facts, analyses which help counter inaccurate beliefs about racism, counter stories to the ones that they get in the news. Whiteness should not be the invisible norm. And then positive ways to be white, including history of white anti-racist activism. And then I think what's missing here that somebody said is like actual history, which I think is related to an understanding of systemic racism. And then skills. So recognition skills, being able to see it, being able to understand what's happening when you see it. Role-playing responses. Sometimes my daughter will tell me about conflicts that happen in school, and I'll say, well, what would you say to that? Well, I'll play that child, and you play the other child. We often do it about gender, because often kids will say things like, you know, girls can't, when she was in preschool, it was like, girls can't wear blue, you know, and it's like, okay, so let's say that Nathaniel says that to you. I'll say that, and then you tell me what you would say, and then we role play it, and practice it, because these conversations can be hard. And then doing media analysis. This is part of an understanding of systemic racism. When you're able to analyze the media that you're taking in, then you're able to say, like, actually, somebody made a choice to put that image in my brain, and I'm going to make a choice not to adopt it. So so I did this a lot with my child. She was a very gender-conforming child. She still is. She's moving out of it a little more as a 6-year-old, but it's funny because when she was little, we always dressed her in like browns and blacks and blues and tried not to like make her very like stereotypically girly. And as soon as she had any say, she was like, I'm a girl, I'm a princess. I'm gonna wear a dress, I'm gonna wear ruffles, I'm gonna wear pink. And there was some time when I was a little bit like, but if you wanted to be transgender, we'd be okay with that, you know? And she's like, no, that's not who I am. And I realized, like, this is her gender identity. She is, like, far on the end of the spectrum of, like, girliness, and that's how she expresses herself, so I have to support that. So she was obsessed with Disney princesses. We were always talking about Disney princesses. And so I would say, like, but do Disney princesses, like, you know, and I think this is, when you do this, you have to be careful not to shame kids. She loves them. She loves Disney princesses more than life itself. So I can't shame, I can't like ridicule them or just criticize them outright, because then, you know, I have to appreciate them because, you know, there's something that's important to her. And then so she can be, you know, and then I'll say, well, so, but like, why are so many of the Disney princesses white? Why do they have white skin? Like, could Cinderella be brown? Or, you know, why do they always have to marry a white prince? Like, could the prince be black? Would that be okay if you had a white princess and a black prince? And she's like, yeah, we could do that. And then, or I'll say like, well, why does it have to be a prince? Couldn't it be a princess? Couldn't you marry another princess? Or, you know, like, why don't we have any princesses who end up on their own and just like, you know, don't have a romantic relationship? So we like go on and on and on. But, you know, so, and I feel like I'm annoying her. But you know what? She actually took it another way. Like, it wasn't like you're ruining it. So she started at 4 drawing these pictures where she would just like make her princesses brown, you know, and she would do this where she would have a prince that was black, and she would take these people that she held sacred as like, you know, the best people in the world. And she'd say, you know what, they don't have to be white. Like, this is still a great story, you know? And I think what was powerful was that she was able to make that cognitive switch that we have control over this. This is like not a message we just have to absorb. And she continues to play with it. I mean, you know, it gets more complicated as she gets older. But I think that, you know, I share this picture to just kind of say, like, this is part of what it can look like to support kids to just challenge the media that they're taking in, and to think, like, somebody made a choice about this, and we can make a different choice. And then finally, in terms of skills, being a friend, not a bystander. So if someone's being bullied or misunderstood, that you can just step in and connect to that person, that connecting to that person can often do as much as or more than standing up to a bully. So this is a quote that is not the same as Eli's quote this morning, but I don't know if it's a psychology thing where this comes from. But what they say is racial socialization is not what we do once a year. It's what we do consistently, persistently, and in an enduring fashion. So we heard that again as like the diagnosis for if you're actually transgender, you have to express it consistently and persistently. But racial socialization is not like I read one book to her when she was 5, or even I read 7 multicultural books and took her to an event. It's like, how do we talk about race with kids day in and day out, every day of their lives? That's racial socialization. How do we not talk about it and not see it and not pay attention to it every day of their lives? That's also racial socialization. So the color blindness, when that's happening, it's what we're doing consistently and persistently. And often we think in schools, I did that chapter, I did that unit, I read that book. And it's like, no, this is much bigger than that. It's about a daily practice. So I want to give you a couple framing concepts for thinking about this with kids, that the goal for me in terms of how we talk to kids about, white children about race, is to support them to build a positive racial identity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but just off the bat, what do you think it means? Some people will say, like, how can you have a positive racial identity if you're white? What do you think it means for a white person to have a positive racial identity? That's a really good point. So having an understanding of our racial ethnic backgrounds and how whiteness has impacted our lives and our ancestors. So I have a different experience because I grew up in a with a pretty waspy background. All of my ancestors are not all, but like for many generations back, my ancestors are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And then as a 25-year-old, 28-year-old, I converted to Judaism. My partner's a rabbi. And so, but still, like my experience of race as a white person and my racial identity development as a child was informed by Protestantism and like this, having this kind of British ancestry or like colonial American ancestry. And that, so we have different experiences of being white. And so part of our work is to understand for each of us, what does it mean for me, you know, what has being white meant to me in my life and for my ancestors. And you might have ancestors who lived in the US before World War II who weren't considered white, and, you know, and then that there was, for most like European descended Jews, there was a transition in like the 1950s and 60s. But understanding that is, I think, part of building a positive racial identity. And so how has whiteness impacted me, with the knowledge that it's not going to be the same as all white people, just like not all black people have had the same experience, and there are lots of differences in any racial group. Yes, okay. Okay, so let me keep going here. Because I want to share a couple of things. Just the reason why we want to focus on racial identity is because positive racial identity has been connected with success in school, both behaviorally and academically. And so it's a general vision I have for all schools to orient race work around racial identity development, and to say the reason we do this is because it's good for students. It's good for their development, that racial identity, just like we consider all other aspects of their you know, experiences in their gender development, their child development, their academic development, racial identity development is part of who they are. What we know is when you go through the stages of racial identity development, the early stages of like acknowledging that racism exists and that it has an impact on your life often happen for children of color when they're like 4 or 5. So they're very aware race matters at a young age. For white people, it often happens in college, in your first job. Sometimes you never quite get there where you realize what an impact race has on your life. But overall, focusing on racial identity is a way to see this as integral to our work as teachers. And then a teacher's racial identity is their toolbox. So as a teacher, it's going to be very hard for me to support the racial identity development of any student if I haven't been through something that they're going through. If I've never really been through the stages of identity development, then I'm going to have a hard time supporting students in it. And so part of what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow is what is racial identity development? What is some of the theory for white people and for people of color? How do teachers strengthen their racial identity so that they can support students in developing their racial identity? So this is a preview for tomorrow. And I also just want to share some strategies for adults for building a positive racial identity. So acknowledging what we don't know about race and racism. Maybe we don't even know what we don't know, but acknowledging that there are things we don't know, and establishing a learning stance, being open to hearing the experience of students and teachers of color. Practicing talking about race in small groups, inquiry groups. So one of the books that is on for sale here, which is actually the only book that I authored by myself, the other ones are edited, is called Raising Race Questions, and it's about using inquiry to support small group work, thinking about race and racism and really figuring out what we need to learn. That's the kind of thing that would be great for people from this group to go away saying, I'm going to work with 4 other heads of school, or even 1 other heads of school, to do some inquiry about race, to give yourself the space to think and talk about it, to develop your own racial identity, but with colleagues where you don't have to be pretending that you know, because I think that's one of the big things that stops us in our learning is feeling like we have to have all the answers, and it's very hard as the head of school not to feel like you have to already have it all figured out. So giving yourself a chance to practice, talking with students and really believing them. Sometimes when a student's experience is so far from our own, it's hard to believe what they're going through. And then that shuts them down. They don't want to share with us if we're not going to believe them. Talking with colleagues, workshops like this, books, affinity spaces, and then overall a growth mindset. Really believing I can get better at this. When we have a fixed mindset about race and racism, we say, you know, oh, that's not something white people can do, like I was doing in college. You know, only Hillary Lake can do that, but nobody else. Or we feel like, you know, you're either racist or you're not. And so we spend all of our time running to prove, I'm not a racist, I'm not a racist, I'm not a racist. Because if I make one mistake, then I'm a racist, and then it's over. And so in general in our schools, these conversations are not going to happen unless we can have a growth mindset that says, if I make a mistake, it doesn't mean I'm a racist. It means I made a mistake. But if I don't try and make mistakes, I'm not going to learn, I'm not going to get better. So supporting people to see everything that they do, everything that they say as a draft. If I don't make the messy draft the first time, then I'm not going to have anything to improve upon the next time. A couple more strategies: learning about the history of whiteness, learning about your personal history, how your family has benefited by being white. And it's interesting because some people say, you know, look, I didn't grow up wealthy. I didn't grow up in an educated family. I don't understand how we would have benefited from being white. And I think what's important is just to, you know, like you said, there are different experiences of whiteness. And if you grew up in a low-income family, one question to ask is, so what if I grew up in a low-income family that was not white? Like, what if I grew up in the same family, in the same place, but we weren't white? What would our lives have been like? So it doesn't mean that being white means everybody was rich, everybody had grandparents who could pay for them to go to college, everybody had whatever. But it might have meant you could live in places that people of color couldn't live, or you could have citizenship to the US that people from countries of people of color couldn't have citizenship. Like there were 150 years in our country's history when people who were not white couldn't immigrate, couldn't naturalize. It could be the schools that you had access to, or maybe your father or grandfather or mother or grandmother had access to a labor union that was closed to people of color. So just kind of trying to figure that out, how whiteness has impacted you, with the awareness that it won't be the same as for all white people. Receiving feedback non-defensively, like, oh, you got little things stuck in your teeth. Thank you. You know, thank you for pointing that out. Is there anything else? You know, rather than like, you know, shutting it down. I don't want to hear that. Like, I'm liberal, I'm good. There's no reason, there's no way I could be doing something wrong. Taking responsibility for your own learning, and then of course finding role models in doing this. We'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow too, that for me, the pursuit of wholeness is the goal. In talking about race with kids, with each other, in our schools, I believe that racism has a fracturing effect on us as individuals, on our ability to form relationships across race, on our classrooms. And so, you know, my goal is to kind of reach towards a wholeness that would be there if it weren't for racism. And I realize that's kind of pie in the sky. Eli talked about his friends who are kind of like, you know, more soft in their language. That's me. Like, I know that wholeness is a very abstract thing, it's hard to get to, but a lot of the time, kids and adults think the only reason to talk about race is to produce sadness, guilt, anger, and fear. And because that's what happens when they do it. And so I want to just put out there that I don't think that's the point. I know that that's a part of the process that happens for people when we talk about this subject, but for me, the point is to get to a place of wholeness for individuals to show up as their full selves, for all of us to be able to show up and to be healthy members of a multiracial community. And it's very hard to do that if we're not willing and able to talk about race. And along the way, we might feel fear sadness, anger, guilt. But if we know that that's not the point, then maybe it will be more worth it to get to a place of wholeness. So I have a couple resources to share. My books are up there, 2 of them. But then these are the best books that I have seen recently. So they're all from the last year or 2. Chris Emden's at Columbia. He wrote For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood, and the rest of y'all too. I didn't want to read this book because I'm like, I don't teach in the hood. I wouldn't say I taught in the hood even if I did. I wouldn't use that language. You know, it just didn't seem like it applied to me. This book is for any teacher who teaches children for whom the American educational system was not structured around their needs. Okay, and it's fabulous. It has so many practical strategies. I recommend it for anybody. Despite the Best Intentions by Amanda Lewis and John Diamond. They're both sociologists. And basically what they're saying is we have to understand how race impacts our schools, in part because nobody is trying to mess this up. We're all trying to get it right, and we're still messing it up. And they have so many explanations about the larger structure of race and racism that impacts our schools, and it's so applicable and very readable. And then this book by Dorothy Steele, who's actually Claude Steele's wife. Claude Steele wrote the book Whistling Vivaldi, which is all about stereotype threat. This is about creating identity-safe classrooms. Not just about race, it's also around gender and sexuality. But it's about so understanding that stereotype threat exists, what do we do about it? And I might say more about stereotype threat tomorrow. So I want to name one of the things that I do is I am the director of an organization called the Race Institute for K-12 Educators, and we do 3-day workshops for teachers to do the personal and long-term growth of identity development that's hard to do in a 2-hour session, or when your boss is watching, which is often the context that I'm in. And so we are doing a Heads of School Institute in 2018, the summer of 2018. We don't have dates yet, but if you're interested in being on the mailing list, you can go to raceinstitute.org and sign up, and then you'll get information about it. We did a Race Institute last year, and Margaret Havland, who's the assistant head of school at Westtown School, said you need one just for heads. And so it's in the works, and I don't know where it's going to be. And then also feel free to contact me. A negative white racial identity is not about feeling bad about being white or being even stigmatized for being white. It's almost, the way that it shows up in psychology is almost like in photography, that a negative racial identity is the absence of a racial identity. It's a lack of awareness or consciousness of what it means to be white, that being white has any impact on your life. No knowledge that being white impacts your life. And then what happens, what they say in psychology, is that because you have no awareness of the way that whiteness impacts your life, you have an identity that's based on falsehoods, that you believe stereotypes, that you have never taken you've never gone through the process of analyzing stereotypes or myths, racial myths, and so you just think that they're true. And so you believe them. And so it's a delusional identity, they say, because it's not based in reality. There's no consciousness of whiteness or of race. Whereas a positive racial identity is what many of you were saying. It is the awareness, the conscious awareness that being white impacts your life, that it has to in a society that has historically distributed resources and opportunities based on skin color, then being white is going to impact your life. So how does it impact my life? And having a positive racial identity means you see that and you feel like there's still things you can do to be proactive about working against racism, even using your privilege or your status to work against racism. And so having a positive racial identity is not synonymous with feeling good about being white. That's a common misconception, is that then you feel good about being white. It's not that. It's about a conscious awareness of whiteness. A negative racial identity is not about feeling bad about being white. It's about having no awareness of whiteness. When you feel really badly for being white and you feel guilty and you feel embarrassed, that's in between the two. Because part of going from having no awareness of whiteness to being able to consciously use your whiteness to work against racism is figuring all this stuff out and learning about it. and learning the history, and sometimes that doesn't feel good, and sometimes there's guilt and embarrassment. That's where I was for about 6 years. And still sometimes am. So we have to close, we have to go to dinner, but we're gonna pick up again tomorrow morning. And I just appreciate all of you for your honesty and your integrity, and thank you for being here.